The forest swallowed the night in layers of wet fog and drifting cold, turning every tree into a looming silhouette and every footstep into a whisper of uncertainty. Deep inside this maze of shadows moved a worn American infantry company, marching through darkness with failing radios and a map that no longer matched the earth beneath their boots. They believed they were advancing toward friendly ground, but the scout at the front felt something different. A tension woven into the land, a silence too perfect, a stillness that warned of unseen eyes waiting in the dark. The scout had walked point for weeks, chosen not for rank, but for instinct. He read terrain the way others read faces, sensing danger in ridgelines, interpreting slopes, drawing meaning from the way fog pooled in certain hollows. And tonight, everything in front of him whispered that the forest had been rearranged by enemy hands. The path they were following felt wrong, the angles unnatural, the quiet too strategic. If the company stayed on their planned route, they would walk straight into the jaws of an ambush prepared long before they arrived. With no time to explain and no chance for debate, he stepped off the assigned trail and into the wilderness, choosing an unmarked descent into the thick undergrowth. It was a direction no officer had ordered, one impossible to justify with their broken map, and yet every instinct in his body told him it was the only way to save the men behind him. One by one, 120 soldiers followed him into the fog, placing their survival entirely in the hands of a single scout leading them into the unknown. The slope he chose was steep enough that every step felt like sliding, forcing the men to grip branches, rocks, or whatever roots they could find to avoid tumbling into the darkness. Only the scout moved with confidence, his boots touching down in deliberate testing motions as he searched for signs of danger hidden beneath the night. A faint glow flickered through the fog far above, the glimmer of embers shielded by earthworks. Machine gun nests, at least 3, positioned exactly along the company's original route. Had they continued another 100 yards, they would have been funneled into a killing corridor with no cover. The scout felt the reality settle in his chest, making each breath heavier. They were already inside the perimeter of an enemy trap. He motioned sharply for silence, though the men needed none. Every soldier behind him could feel it too. The forest was too still, too engineered, as if the wilderness itself were waiting to erupt. The only way out was to continue down the slope into terrain thick enough to hide them. Roots snagged on their gear, the mud sucked at their boots, and branches tore at their sleeves, but the descent bought them time. The ground gradually flattened, revealing a sliver of a hidden trail carved by runoff and concealed by brush. It wasn't safe, but it was real. It was a vein of earth untouched by the enemy, and the scout prayed it would hold long enough for 120 men to pass unseen. The valley they entered felt ancient, its towering trees twisting overhead like ribs of a collapsed cathedral. Water dripped constantly from the canopy, masking their footsteps beneath a curtain of soft, steady noise. It was the one advantage nature offered them. The scout paused at a jagged outcropping of stone, pressing his hand to its cold surface. Untouched. Natural. It meant they were slipping into terrain the enemy had not prepared. Not yet. The men behind him whispered among themselves, their voices strained by exhaustion and fear. The lieutenant approached with a limp he refused to acknowledge, asking the scout in a low voice whether this new path would lead them closer to safety. The scout didn't answer immediately. The truth was that he didn't know. What he did know was the land's voice. Somewhere ahead, beyond folds of unseen ridges, a river formed the boundary of their regiment's operational zone. If they found that water, they might find a way home. Trust was all they had left. The lieutenant nodded at the scout's silent resolve and motioned the men forward. They followed as if clinging to a thin, fragile thread, each soldier sensing that turning back was no longer an option. The valley's floor darkened as the fog thickened, and they moved deeper into its shadows, guided only by instinct and the hope that the wilderness still had one unguarded path left to offer. A narrow stream cut through the valley floor, glimmering under the faint moonlight like a silver thread guiding them forward. The scout crouched beside it, letting his fingers skim across the cold water. It flowed toward lower ground, bending through terrain that maps would ignore, but life depended on. Where water moved freely, armies often overlooked. The scout trusted that ancient logic more than any paper chart left in his pack. As dawn approached, the fog shifted from dense darkness to drifting sheets of pale light, exposing just enough of the forest to make danger feel closer. The scout halted the column beneath a cluster of fallen logs and low branches, forming a natural shelter. A few minutes of rest could save lives, but too long could cost everything. The men sagged against the trees, their breathing quiet but ragged, hands trembling slightly as they checked weapons dulled by moisture. A faint metallic click broke the fragile quiet, a bolt sliding into place on a rifle somewhere beyond the fog. The scout froze, head tilted, listening. Enemy patrols were moving along the ridgeline, sweeping the forest for exactly the kind of stragglers his company had become. Time was slipping away. Rest was over. With a silent gesture, he pulled the men back to their feet, leading them forward before daylight revealed their silhouettes to the enemy watching above. The valley narrowed into a bottleneck, its trees closing around them in a suffocating corridor. The scout knelt and studied the ground. Fresh tracks, 3 or 4 men, moving across their route rather than along it. A patrol had passed recently. The soil was still soft from the pressure of boots. They were dangerously close. He signaled a freeze, and the entire column stopped so abruptly that not a single twig snapped. Moments later, echoing through the fog like a warning from the trees, voices drifted from ahead. 2 enemy soldiers were speaking in low, casual tones, unaware that more than 100 Americans were perched in stillness just yards away. The scout motioned the men to crouch, lowering their profiles beneath the thick brush. The voices grew louder, and shapes flickered in the shifting gray. They were coming down the same narrow path. The scout guided the men silently off the trail and into a curtain of vines that draped down a steep embankment. One by one, they slid behind the natural screen just as the patrol stepped into view. Breath held, hearts pounding, leaves brushing helmets. The patrol paused, one man staring at the ground as though sensing something amiss. Seconds stretched. Then, satisfied, the soldiers moved on. Only after their footsteps faded did the scout emerge, leading the company deeper down the embankment, straight into terrain no sane officer would have chosen, but the only place left where shadows could hide them. The embankment led into a narrow ravine where the walls rose high on either side, covered in ferns and black moss. It felt like descending into the earth itself, a place where sound died instantly and light struggled to survive. The scout welcomed the darkness. It softened their movement and disguised their presence, but it also meant that finding a safe exit would be more difficult. Ravines could channel them straight into dead ends or into traps laid by enemy patrols familiar with the terrain. The men pressed forward, stepping carefully on the damp stones that lined the ravine floor. The scout's eyes adjusted to the dimness, scanning the contours of the walls. Cracks, folds, openings disguised as shadows. After an hour of silent movement, he spotted a narrow break in the rock, a slanted path twisting upward. Natural, concealed, easily missed, but it pointed toward higher ground, a vantage point that could tell him whether they were outrunning danger or marching straight toward it. Climbing the path was brutal. The ground crumbled beneath boots, and hands scraped against jagged stone as men pulled themselves upward. But when they reached the top, the world opened before them. Through the thinning fog, the scout saw the ridgelines ahead. Enemy trenches dotted the crest to the east, their silhouettes barely visible. But to the west lay a corridor of low ground, unguarded and winding toward the river. It was risky, exposed in places, but it was a way out, the only one. They moved westward along a slope lined with dead branches and old fallen trees. The scout advanced slowly, counting the seconds between distant bursts of gunfire to judge where the enemy was concentrating their attention. The sounds came from far behind them, reinforcements arriving, patrols sweeping, the larger machine of war closing in. If the enemy realized a full company had slipped through their perimeter, the hunt would intensify. The men grew quieter as fatigue dug deeper into their bones. Their boots were soaked, uniforms stiff with mud and sweat, stomachs empty except for ration crumbs saved from the previous day. The scout could feel their weight behind him, not physical, but emotional. Every decision became heavier when 120 lives followed without question. Yet he also felt something else: trust. A silent, growing current that pushed them forward even when their bodies begged for rest. By midday, the fog had lifted enough to reveal distant movement along the eastern ridge. Enemy soldiers shifting positions, scanning the forest, tightening a net that no longer contained its prey. The scout realized the truth. The enemy knew someone had slipped through, but had not yet located which direction they'd gone. He needed to stay unpredictable, bending the route away from expected paths. With a sharp gesture, he veered left, leading the men through a thicket so dense it tore open sleeves and scraped against helmets. It hurt. It slowed them, but it kept them invisible. The forest floor grew soft and spongy as they approached marshland. Water gathered in shallow pools, reflecting the gray sky in trembling ripples. Moving through it meant noise, sloshing, splashing, sucking mud. But avoiding it meant staying on dry terrain the enemy was far more likely to patrol. The scout tested the first pool with his boot, sinking ankle-deep into the cold muck. It wasn't ideal. It was necessary. One by one, the men stepped into the marsh, their movements slow and deliberate. The mud clung to their legs, the water rose above their boots, and every step became a battle against the earth itself. But the thick reeds offered cover, swaying in the breeze, masking their shapes from anyone watching from higher ground. Progress was painfully slow, but safety grew with every yard they gained. Halfway through the marsh, an enemy flare shot into the sky far behind them, casting the forest in harsh white light. The scout froze. The flare wasn't random. It was a signal, a command, a discovery. The enemy had found the company's old trail. They were accelerating the search. Without hesitation, the scout ordered the men to drop low into the reeds. The flare faded. Darkness returned. The marsh swallowed them whole. And when they rose again, they moved faster, determined not to be caught in the open when the next flare lit the sky. Leaving the marsh behind, the company emerged onto firmer ground, where the trees stood taller and straighter, their branches forming a natural hall of silent shadows. The scout sensed a shift in the forest. The air grew colder, crisper. Somewhere ahead, water moved with force. A river. The river. The boundary they needed to reach. Hope flickered through the column like a spark too faint to speak aloud. But hope wasn't enough. Enemy units often guarded crossings and banks, using natural barriers as choke points. The scout studied every slope, every pattern in the trees, every ripple of wind. Then he found what he was looking for. A thin line of mist rising between two ridges, a sign of water below, but with no smoke, no footprints, no disturbed earth. The area might be unguarded, if only for a short window. Before committing the entire company, the scout slid down the slope alone, disappearing into the brush. He moved silently, keeping low, alert to every broken twig and unnatural silence. When he reached the riverbank, his breath caught in his chest. There were no enemy positions, no trenches, no patrols. The crossing was exposed, but it was theirs. He turned back up the slope with urgency in his steps. They had one chance, and daylight was already bleeding into the sky. Reaching the river took longer than expected. The slope was slick, and the men's legs were weak from hours of marching. But the scout pushed them forward with quiet urgency. The sound of rushing water grew louder, guiding them toward salvation. When they reached the bank, the river's surface shimmered like a silver blade cutting through the forest. Crossing it was perilous. The water was icy and fast, swelling from recent rains. Weapons had to be held overhead, and men had to lock arms to keep from being dragged downstream. The scout entered first, stepping into the current until it pushed hard against his chest. If he could stand, they all could. He braced himself, signaled the men, and slowly the column began to wade across. Halfway through the river, branches cracked in the distance. Enemy voices, shouting orders, spreading through the forest. They had finally closed in on the company's trail. The water roared louder as adrenaline surged through the men. They moved faster, clinging to one another as the current pulled and tugged. When the last soldier reached the far bank, the scout pushed him up the slope, then turned and scanned the opposite shore. Shadows appeared between the trees. The enemy had arrived seconds too late. On the far side of the river, the terrain opened into rolling ground, dotted with clusters of tall grass and boulders. It offered better visibility, but also meant they could be spotted more easily. The scout kept the company low, weaving them through depressions in the land where shadows clung longest. The enemy voices across the river faded, replaced by the distant thud of mortars being adjusted. They were firing blind, unsure where their prey had gone. The lieutenant moved beside the scout, his limp worse now, but his determination unbroken. He whispered that the regiment should be somewhere within marching distance, just beyond the next ridge or two. But distance meant little in a forest shaped by chaos and war. The scout kept searching the ground for signs. Old boot prints, broken branches, the faint smell of smoke carried on the wind. Hours passed. The sun dipped behind clouds. The forest darkened again. Then the scout found it. A spent cartridge casing, not from enemy rifles, but American. Fresh, fired within the last day. He lifted it toward the lieutenant, who exhaled with relief. Their regiment was near. But the enemy behind them still moved, tightening their search. The final stretch would be the most dangerous. The scout tightened his grip on his weapon and motioned the men forward. They were close, too close to fail now. As night approached again, fog returned to the forest, drifting through the trees in soft, ghost-like tendrils. The scout used it like a shield, guiding the company along a ridge overlooking a wide field scarred by old shell impacts. On the far side of that field, faint outlines of sandbags and wooden posts formed a defensive line, American. But reaching it meant crossing the open ground below. The scout studied the field, tracing potential routes with his eyes. Some depressions offered cover, but others were exposed. He needed a path that kept the men low while avoiding the swampy patches where boots might sink and slow them. After minutes of silent calculation, he signaled the column to follow him into the shallow gutters carved by years of rain. The trenches of water and mud became their lifeline, guiding them carefully across the field's expanse. Halfway across, a flare burst into the sky from behind. The enemy's pursuit had caught up again. White light drenched the field, revealing shapes sprawled low against the ground. The men froze. Seconds crawled by. The flare faded. Darkness reclaimed the land. Without a word, the scout urged them forward, faster now, pushing through the final yards as gunfire erupted behind them. The enemy had seen movement, but too late. American voices shouted from the far line. The company was almost home. The final dash toward the friendly lines felt unreal, as if the ground itself were carrying them forward. American machine guns opened fire over their heads, laying suppressive fire as the last of the company scrambled across the remaining distance. The scout stayed at the back, ensuring no man was left behind. Bullets tore through the trees behind him, enemy shouts echoing through the darkness. But he kept moving, pushing the final stragglers toward safety. When he finally crossed the sandbag line, collapsing into the dirt alongside the men he'd led through the wilderness, the defenders stared in stunned disbelief. They had expected a handful of survivors, not an entire company emerging from a direction no one believed possible. The lieutenant reported their ordeal with brief, tired words. Cut off, surrounded, no map, no radios, and guided out by a scout who trusted the land more than any printed orders. As medics tended to the exhausted men, the scout stepped away for a moment, looking back at the forest he had fought for hours to escape. It loomed silently in the night, hiding the paths he had walked, the choices he had made, and the danger that had closed around them like a tightening fist. Yet somehow, through instinct and courage, he had carved a route through the impossible. One man, one gamble, one detour, leading 120 soldiers out of a kill zone that should have ended them before dawn.